In Luke 10, we have the report of the mission of the 70. Starting in verse 1, the text reads, "After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field.'" Now, I find this interesting. We covered these first 2 verses pretty well in the last 2 weeks. But as we continue on here, Jesus does 2 things in this verse that would seem to run counter to one another, and to the emphasis with which this passage has often been preached. First, Jesus communicates to these 70 evangelists a sense of urgency about the harvest which is at hand. The harvest, he says, which would appear to be a euphemism for the elect who are poised to become the saved, is plentiful, but the workers are few. Now, with that kind of setup, with that kind of premise established, one might expect that what Jesus would say next would be something like, "So get out there and get after it." But that isn't what he says at all. I mean, yes, he does send the 70 out, but he doesn't send them out to reap the harvest. No, he appears to have other people in mind to do that. What Jesus tells the 70 is, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. But the 70 aren't charged with the duty of reaping the harvest. They're charged with the duty of preparing the way for the Lord. As Luke told us in verse 1 of Luke 10, Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. And that wasn't a secondary goal. That was a primary goal of this mission, to lay the groundwork, to prepare the soil for what the Lord would later do. And even Jesus himself did not seem to expect to reap much of a harvest when he visited these places after the mission of the 70. Rather, he instructed those who were going on that mission to ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers for the harvest. And I think that's something that we should take to heart. In 1 Corinthians 3, 5-9, Paul tells us, what after all is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe. As the Lord has assigned to each his task, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one shared purpose, for we are God's fellow workers. Yet we tend to act and speak as though the only thing that really matters is the harvest. We tend to think of sowing seed or watering as the booby prize, the consolation prize. I mean, you send some people on a mission trip, and when they come back, what do you want to hear from them? A tally of conversions. How many people were saved? How many did you baptize? And if that number seems too low, then we say, well, at least we planted some good seed. You never know what might come of that. And we say that as though seed sowing on its own doesn't have any real value unless it results in conversion. But that isn't what Jesus seems to think. No, when he sent out the mission of the 70, he did so with the full expectation that what they would do is to prepare the way ahead of him. And that workers for the harvest, beyond the 70 and beyond Jesus, would be needed later. And he seemed to have no expectations of the 70 that they would produce anything beyond the scope of the mission they'd been given. He wasn't going to stand there waiting for them to return and saying, okay, what's the head count? And then, when the number's not quite up to snuff, responding, well, at least you sowed some good seed. Who knows if that might not yield something worthwhile someday? No. Jesus saw seed sowing as a worthy mission unto itself. And we would do well to follow the Lord's lead on this matter. Moving on to verse 3 of Luke 10, "Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves." And here I just want to point out that this statement by Jesus, "I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves," underlines what Jesus says later in this passage when the missionaries return, rejoicing that even the demons submitted to them in Jesus' name. And Jesus replies by telling them not to miss the point of the mission. Yes, he had sent them out with power, even power over the demons, but he had not sent them out with the mission of slaying demons. He had not sent them out for the purpose of exercising power. No, as a matter of fact, when Jesus had commissioned the 70, he said nothing to them that should have given them the impression that he was even sending them out with power. Rather, he told them he was sending them out like lambs among wolves. That is, he had no intention that his missionaries should present themselves as people possessed of the power of Christ. Rather, he sought for them to present themselves as people possessed with the meekness of Christ. And meekness is not the same thing as weakness. Weakness is complete vulnerability, the lack of power. Meekness is power under control. Meekness is the guy with 500 horses under the hood who doesn't rev his engine at the stoplight. Meekness is the governor's daughter who gets pulled over for speeding and doesn't say, "Do you know who I am?" Meekness is the weightlifter turned jeweler who uses his strength to delicately and precisely cut stones in order to create fine things of great beauty. Meekness is power under control. Meekness is Jesus giving the missionaries power to work mighty works in his name, but telling them, "I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves." Because he wants them to lead with their vulnerability. He wants them to go forth with humble hearts. He wants the first side of them that those whom they encounter to see to be their gentler side. Now, that isn't the only side of them he wants them to see, as we'll read later down in the text. But clearly, that's the first side he wants them to see. But make no mistake about it, being meek, going forth as a lamb among wolves, may mean that they will suffer personal injuries, personal indignities, personal losses for the name of Christ. As Jesus told the 12 when he sent them out sometime earlier, Matthew 10, 17 through 20, "Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." Now, there's no evidence in the Bible or anywhere else that either the mission of the 12 or the mission of the 70 ever encountered this kind of opposition. Rather, it seems that when Jesus spoke of the persecution of his missionaries, that he was speaking prophetically, because indeed, the very thing he speaks of in Matthew 10 happened, just as he said it would, within days or weeks of the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. The point for today's lesson, however, is that when Jesus sent out the 70, he told them, "I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves." And he wasn't saying, "I'm leaving you on your own. I'm leaving you to your own devices. I'm abandoning you." He wasn't saying, "I'm sending you out in weakness." He was saying, "I'm sending you out in meekness." That is, I'm sending you out with power, checked by humility. And this is demonstrated in Luke 10 by what Jesus says next, picking up in verse 4, Do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. Now, in your translation there in the bulletin, it says scrip and not bag. To me, this is something really remarkable, because what Jesus tells the 70 here is that he wants them to go forth with complete faith in him from the get-go. Don't take any money with you. Don't take a change of clothes or a spare set of shoes with you, and don't take a scrip with you. Because the bag here that's in view isn't luggage. If you look this verse up in the King James Version, what you find there is the word that's translated bag in most Bibles is translated scrip in the King James. And here the King James people absolutely got this right. This is no small point, because in English, when someone says take no bag with you, the kind of bag that comes to mind is usually some kind of luggage. Maybe not a suitcase, but a satchel of some kind, or a tied up cloth filled with provisions, like the kind of cloth you'd see in a cartoon from the Depression era of a hobo with a pole slung over his shoulder, with a bag tied on the end of it, which, by the way, is where the word hobo comes from. The pole that's slung over his shoulder isn't a pole, it's the handle of a hoe. And a hoe boy was an itinerant farmhand, a man traveling from place to place with his hoe looking for work. And he would carry his provisions in a bag tied to the end of his hoe. But I digress. The point is that what's in view in Luke 10:4 is not luggage or a knapsack or a lunchbox. Now, it becomes clear further down in the passage that Jesus doesn't want the 70 to take any provisions with them on this journey. Rather, he wants them to rely on the providence of God. But that's not what's in view when the Lord says to the 70, take no scrip with you. Because a scrip, as I said, isn't luggage. A scrip is a begging bag. Today, if you go to any major tourist district, you'll find street musicians, buskers of various kinds plying their trades for money. And every one of them has a hat or a paper cup or a guitar case sitting open in front of them. And everybody knows what that open container is for. If you enjoyed the performance, then you should drop something into the container. And the proper English word for such a container, for such a receptacle set out for the purpose of receiving money from the general public, is scrip. And in first century Palestine, one of the more common kinds of street performers was the street prophet or the street preacher. And in order to make their living, the street preacher would put out a scrip before him. And if people liked his message, they would drop a little something in the scrip. But Jesus tells the 70, just as he had told the 12 before them, take no scrip with you. Which is one of the reasons why I maintain that the church is not a charity. That's why on our new website, where we now finally have a giving page, I was very clear with the designer of the website. No, the button should not say donation. It should say give. We should never seek to receive money from the general public in exchange for the message that we bring. The church is a sacred trust. And the church should receive gifts only from those who have been truly fed by the church, who've received the gospel, who've believed it, and who've obeyed it. As Jesus goes on to say in verses 5 through 6 of Luke 10, when you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. If a man of peace is there, your peace will rest on him. If not, it will return to you. And this is important for us to understand, because the peace of which Jesus speaks here is not the peace of teaching the world to sing in perfect harmony, grow apple trees and honeybees and snow white turtle doves. No, peace is surrender. In the first century, The Middle East was part of the occupied territories of the Roman Empire. Now the locals, the people who knew of a time before it was occupied, to them, the Roman occupation was perceived as an act of aggression or oppression, but that wasn't the way the Romans saw it. No, as the Romans understood the matter, the Middle East was in chaos before they arrived, with minor governments and city-states constantly warring with one another, and with things largely in disorder and disarray. And when they had brought their occupying forces, yes, the people lost their sovereignty, but they gained law and order and the strength to enforce those laws. Plus, they gained a variety of public services, the richness of Roman heritage and culture, and the protection of the Roman armed forces. And what the Romans called this inclusion in the Roman Empire was the peace of Rome. Pax Romani, or Pax Romana. And that's the exact same idea Jesus has in mind when he tells the 70 that the first thing they should do whenever they entered a house was to bid that house peace, because the peace that they were bidding wasn't the peace of Rome. It wasn't Pax Romana. It was the peace of Christ. Pax Christi. Remember, Jesus was sending out the 70 in his name. They weren't going out in the name of Caesar or in the name of generalized goodwill. This is not a humanitarian mission. No, these evangelists were going out in the name of Jesus as his ambassadors, as his envoys. And Christ expected them to present themselves as such from the very get-go. And he wanted them to use that fact as a litmus test of sorts. If the head of the household will receive you when you introduce yourself by saying, "I bid you the peace of Christ," then stay in that house. Now, that much of verses 5 and 6 of Luke 10 I understand pretty well. What's clear to me in these verses is that the missionaries were to subject any potential host for them to a test. And it seems pretty clear how the test was to be administered and what they were to do with the results of the test. If a man of peace was there, they were to stay in that house. And if not, we learn further down in the text, they were to move on after giving the people in that house a piece of the mind of Christ. Which is not clear, what is not clear from Luke 10, 5 through 6, however, is how the test was to be evaluated, how it was to be read, how it was to be interpreted. I mean, Jesus says in verse 6, if a man of peace is there, your peace will rest on him. If not, it will return to you. But he doesn't say what that means. He doesn't say how these evangelists were supposed to be able to tell whether the peace that they had bidden that household had come to rest on a man of peace or had returned to them. This isn't like the test that Noah administered to see if the waters had receded after the flood. Jesus didn't say, take a box of doves with you and let them help you administer the test. If a man of peace is there, a dove of peace will light upon him. No, he didn't give them any instructions, as far as we know, about how to discern between a man of peace and a man of non-peace. But he clearly expected the 70 to have the ability to make that discernment. But I wish Luke had given us more information about the test itself. You know, years ago, I led a mission trip from Houston to Green Forest, Arkansas. We went up there with 2 van loads of people and 2 trailers full of stuff to help a small congregation there put on a vacation Bible school. For the most part, we were warmly received by that church. We stayed in their homes of the members there. We ate dinner together with the whole church every night of the VBS and the fellowship hall. There were clearly a number of people of peace in that congregation. And they enjoyed our company and seemed to have us, seemed happy to have us there and celebrated together with us the good things that came out of that missionary effort. But as Much as we were received and appreciated by some in the congregation, there were some who remained very suspicious of us the whole time we were there. In particular, there was one elder who made it just as clear as he could make it that he was going to be watching us very, very closely, and that if we made one misstep, he'd pull the plug on the whole deal right then, right there. Now, this is the same elder who one night toward the end of that week, during one of the adult Bible classes, took it upon himself to confess the preacher's sins for him. Most of which consisted of the fact that this preacher had been teaching this Bible class all week and hadn't said one word against a variety of denominations that this elder felt needed to be openly condemned, which denominations he rattled off in quick succession and then did his best to try to shame this preacher for failing to preach the gospel. Now, praise be to God that I wasn't in that classroom. And I only learned about that incident sometime after the fact, because if I had been there to witness this verbal assault and dereliction of good judgment on behalf of this church leader, I would have had to go back to my elders and explain to them why the mission trip had got cut short and how it was that I felt obliged to bring a jobless preacher and his family home with me when I left Arkansas. Well, that isn't how things turned out. We made it all the way through the week without incident and sowed a lot of good seed. But from the time I met this elder, this man in question, I sensed his hostility toward us, and I sensed it long before it came to the surface. I sensed that he was not a man of peace as I understand what a man of peace is. And this sense caused me and the rest of the missions team to feel a degree of dis-ease the whole time we were at this church, to feel like we needed to walk on eggshells all week, because it was never clear to us just what might set this fellow off. But I don't know if that sense was a matter of spiritual discernment or simply human intuition. And I don't know by what means Jesus expected the 70 to discern between a man of peace and a man of non-peace, but I presume that in both cases the Spirit was involved. As Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 2, 12 through 16, now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, revealing spiritual realities to you who are spiritual beings. The natural person does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person discerns all things, even as he himself remains inscrutable to the world. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Well, Jesus anticipated and expected that the 70 would be able to discern between a man of peace and a man of non-peace. And when they found a house where the head of household was a man of peace, Jesus told them in verse 7, stay in that house, eating and drinking whatever they give you. For the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. Jesus wanted his disciples to be discerning when it came to going and staying where they were welcome. And I find this highly instructive. Now, we're running out of time for today's lesson. We'll be talking more about this point when I pick up here next week. But here in Luke 10, 5 through 7, Jesus instructed these disciples to go where they were welcome and to stay where they were welcome. And I think that that presents us with a question that's worth asking, which is, why would Jesus do that? Why would he do that? Why would he instruct his disciples? Why would he instruct his missionaries to take the path of least resistance? Why would he send them to go where they were welcome rather than sending them to go where they were unwelcome? Why would Jesus, of all people, tell his followers, his ambassadors, his representatives, to take the easy way? I mean, all my life I've been told when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and that whenever you have a decision to make, you should choose the right thing rather than the easy thing. And the implication is always that the right thing must be the harder thing to do. The easy thing is the wrong thing. I mean, I've never seen a morality tale where it turned out that the easy choice was the right choice. So why would Jesus instruct his disciples to take the easy road and go where they were welcome and not where they were unwelcome? I mean, he did not say that he was sending them out. Didn't he say that he was sending them out like lambs among wolves? And wouldn't that seem to indicate that he was sending them out to their deaths, or at the very least to face threatening opposition? Yet they all come back alive. They all came back victorious. They all came back rejoicing. And why is that? Well, partly because Jesus told them to go only where it appeared that they had a modicum of a chance of getting a foothold. Don't go where you're not welcome, he told them. Go only where you are welcome. Why would he do that? Well, maybe because that's where the fields were ripe for the harvest. And maybe, just maybe, the right thing and the easier thing are sometimes the same thing. But we'll pick up with those questions next week. That's my lesson for today.